fellow named Mark, another Mark, asked me to do a video on blues. So I'm not a historian, but I have been playing the blues since the 1960s. I know a little bit about it, and I'll tell you what I know and see if that can help you get a foundation. Now, I'm going to keep it simple because the blues, there's a lot to it, but I'm going to give you the basic structure, and as far as when we get into the chord structure and the structure of the stanzas, I'm going to keep that to the basic as well. So here we go. We're going to talk about 4 areas. We're going to hit tonality. I'm going to talk about the notes that are involved. We're going to talk about chordality, if that's a word, and we're going to talk about the chords that are involved. We're going to talk about the structure musically, and then we're going to talk about lyrically how it's structured. And I'll give examples all along the way, and I hope that they're relevant to you. And that way it'll give you an idea. So let's talk about, first of all, the tones that are involved in the blues. So let's give, as a start, we'll talk about your basic major scale. So in the key of G, and you'll recognize that as your typical do, re, mi scale, and it's all major notes. It's all the basic notes of the scale. In the blues, we tend to use certain flatted notes. So instead of maybe using the third of the scale, we will use the flatted third of the scale. Instead of using the fifth, we might use the flatted fifth. Instead of using the seventh of the scale, we use the flatted seventh. Now we may use the natural sevenths, fifths, and thirds, but we might use the flatted version to slide up or some other technique to approach that. So, and you'll find that blues, as complex as it is, it has all sorts of structures. But here is the basic pentatonic, meaning 5-note scale that we use in the blues. So instead of, we will use pentatonic scale is actually something that's used in Japanese music as well. They use a pentatonic scale, but here we're using it for the blues. And as I said, we're going to use certain techniques. So we can use, for example, a slide. That would be a slide. And we would use a hammer-on. Be hammer-ons. We might use a pull-off. That was a little hammer-on there, stunk in. There's a hammer-on. I tend to use hammer-ons quite a bit. We use slides. That would be a slide. Combine those. And we can also use what they call double stops, 2 notes at a time. And we can also use bends, and you've heard these. That's an example of some of the notes and how we use them in the blues. That certainly doesn't mean that you can't use them in other styles of music. In fact, an interesting thing has happened, just a bit of history. I'm not a historian, but I would bet that this is an African experience, African-American experience, that the Africans brought over, and their work in the fields was tough, and they were treated poorly. And as a result, they used music to kind of lighten their load. And you'll find this you'll find the blues structure in churches. They have a thing called a call and response, where you might have a phrase and then you might have a response from the choir or a response from the congregation. And we'll get into some of that as well. But as I said, I'm no historian, but that would be I would be confident in saying that that's where that came from. Interestingly, the white folks took that black experience and they ran off with it and adapted it to their own selves. So you'll hear you'll hear a lot of music that is white music that has blues structure to it, and we'll talk about that too. Let's get into the chords next. And the chords that we typically use in blues, basically, are seventh chords. So whereas in a nice country song you might use, and then you would switch to a 4 chord. That would be the C. And then when it's time to switch to your 5th, and you have kind of a church progression, if you will. That's a basic triad. Now in the blues, we're more likely to use 7th chords all the way around. Now we're switching to the 4 chord, and we're into a 7th there. Then when it's time to switch to the 5th chord, we'll use the 7th chord there. And I'm using the 1-4-5 terminology. 1 being in the key of G would be a G, and the 4 would be a C, and then the 5 would be the dominant chord, or the 5th. So I'm using 7th chords the whole way. So don't get those confused. The chord is part of the scale versus the structure of the chord itself as being a 7th chord. So you can see it has a different sort of a sound. Instead of it's and actually it can get fairly complex if you go into, let's say, a jazz version. There's a tune called Black Coffee, and it goes something like this. I'm feeling kind of lonesome, I haven't slept a wink. I watch the door, I walk the floor, and in between I drink black coffee. Love's a hand-me-down brew. I haven't seen a Sunday in this weekday. Okay, so, and what I was doing there was what we call, and this is the next topic, the structure of the song musically, and that was a 12-bar blues. And a 12-bar blues, you're playing the 1 chord for 4 bars, then you would switch to the 4 chord for 2 more bars, and you might switch back to the 1 chord for 2 more bars or measures. Then you would go to the 5th chord for 1 measure, the 4th chord for 1 measure, and the 1 chord for 1 measure, and then you turn it around and get ready for the next 12-bar segment. And that's what I was doing with Black Coffee. And the chords were different because the jazz guys adapted the music to their use. You'll also see this in pop music. And this is interesting. There's a song, I'll just go into it. Since you left me, baby, my whole world has changed. Since you left me, baby, my whole world has changed. And everybody tells me I am not the same. So you'll see that 12-bar feel. And in this case, we're using not seventh chords, but triads, basic chords. So pop music took that 12-bar structure and they used it in their own way and didn't use the seventh chords. Okay, so let's try a blues song, and that'll kind of lead us into the next section, which is the lyrical structure of blues. So let's do something that Eric Clapton did some time ago. And by the way, Eric Clapton is a blues historian. You want to know about blues, he's one of the guys you could listen to. I've got you on my mind, feeling kind of sad and low. I got you on my mind, feeling kind of sad and low. I'm wondering why you left me, wondering why you had to go. Okay, so there's a number of elements in there that we want to touch on. First of all, you recognize the 12-bar pattern. I had a little variation of that in there. But the basic structure of the blues is a phrase that takes up the first line. There is a repeat of that phrase that takes up the next line. And then the third line is a kind of a phrase with a kind of a wrap-up feel to it that explains the first two lines. And characteristically, you're not filling the entire phrase with your lyric. You're leaving room for a response, if you will, and sometimes the response is some kind of a music fill. Sometimes it's somebody else singing, but very often it's a music fill. So that's characteristic of that. The important thing in real blues is not to crowd the story, is to let the music breathe and give it a chance to have a music fill, call and response. Hopefully at this point you can recognize some of the elements of blues that make it blues, and whether you hear something from the big band era, like In the Mood, that's a that's In the Mood, and that's a big band era with a blues kind of a structure. You'll hear that structure whether you're listening to pop, country, rock and roll, big band, or the blues itself. If you want to learn to play the blues, the important thing is to work with the structure, work with the notes that I showed you, learn some variations on that, and get together with other people and have a good time. Jam with them. Trade licks and learn from others how to play those licks. And that's really where the learning comes in. So have fun with the blues. Thanks a lot.